Ethan had always been a patient man, but patience, as he had come to learn, had its limits. After nearly a year of relentless harassment from the Homeowners Association, HOA, he had finally reached his breaking point. It started with small things: letters demanding he repaint his house a more appropriate color, remove the flower beds he had spent months nurturing, and even cut down a tree in his backyard because it was deemed unsightly. Every week, there was something new, another absurd rule he had supposedly violated, another fine tacked onto his account. But what finally pushed him over the edge was when they claimed ownership over something that was undeniably his own driveway. When Ethan had purchased his property years ago, he had made sure to check all the legal documents. His land extended past the tree line at the back of the house and included the long gravel driveway leading from the main road to his garage. The HOA, however, had other ideas. They insisted that his driveway was part of a common access route and, according to their interpretation of the neighborhood regulations, needed to remain open at all times. Open to whom? Ethan had asked. He wasn't sharing it with anyone. He lived at the end of a private cul-de-sac, and there were no houses past his. The only people who used his driveway were trespassers, solicitors, nosy neighbors, and the occasional delivery driver who had missed their turn. It made no sense. Still, the HOA wouldn't let it go. Margaret, the HOA president, had shown up unannounced multiple times, clipboard in hand, pointing out imaginary violations and demanding compliance. She had a particular smugness about her, the kind of self-importance that came with unchecked authority. She wasn't just enforcing the HOA rules, she was the rules. Ethan had endured her nonsense for months, ignoring her increasingly aggressive letters and standing his ground whenever she tried to intimidate him in person. But when she left an official notice on his door stating that the HOA had the right to unrestricted access through his driveway, he knew it was time to take action. The next morning, Ethan went out and installed a gate. It wasn't an extravagant structure, just a simple, sturdy iron gate that locked securely and marked the boundary of his property. He had every legal right to do it. His property line clearly extended past the gate, and he wasn't violating any zoning laws. He even double-checked the county records before putting it up, just to be certain. The moment he closed the gate and secured the lock, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Finally, some peace and privacy. But of course, peace was never an option where Margaret was involved. Barely an hour after the gate was in place, Ethan heard an all-too-familiar voice screeching from the sidewalk. He turned to see Margaret storming up his driveway, her face red with barely contained rage. She was dressed in her usual beige blazer, her nails perfectly manicured, as if she had just come from a board meeting where she dictated the fate of lesser mortals. "Good morning, Margaret," Ethan said calmly, folding his arms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she snapped, coming to a stop in front of the locked gate. She rattled it as if testing its strength, then looked at him like he had personally committed treason. "Securing my property," Ethan replied, unfazed. "Which, last I checked, I have every right to do." Margaret scoffed, rolling her eyes. "This is a direct violation of HOA regulations. You cannot block access to a community road." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Community road? This is my driveway, Margaret. It's on my deed. It's private property. You have no authority here." Her nostrils flared. "We have the right to ensure that all properties comply with neighborhood aesthetics and accessibility standards. This gate is illegal, and I will be issuing you a fine immediately. If you do not remove it within 24 hours, the HOA will take further action." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Go ahead and fine me, Margaret. While you're at it, explain to the county why you're trying to impose restrictions on property you don't own." Margaret's face twitched at that. She clearly hadn't expected Ethan to challenge her. She had built her reign on intimidation on homeowners who were too tired or too busy to fight back. She wasn't used to someone standing their ground. "You are making a huge mistake," she hissed, stepping back and pulling out her phone. Ethan watched as she dramatically scrolled through her contacts, pressed a button, and lifted the phone to her ear. "Yes, hello? I need to report an obstruction of a public right-of-way," she said sweetly, but her eyes shot daggers at Ethan. "Yes, it's completely blocking access. This is a serious violation. I need an officer sent here immediately." Ethan sighed. Of course, he had dealt with HOA nonsense before, but this was a new low. Margaret was actually calling the police over a gate on his own property. This wasn't about rules or regulations anymore. This was about control. She wasn't just trying to enforce an imaginary HOA policy. She was trying to win. Ethan leaned casually against the gate, watching her with amusement. You really think the cops are going to care about this? Margaret shot him a venomous glare as she hung up the phone. Oh, they'll care. And when they get here, they'll order you to remove this illegal obstruction. You'll be fined, possibly even arrested, for interfering with community access. You don't stand a chance, Ethan. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. You just made a huge mistake, Margaret. She folded her arms, smirking. Oh, really? And why is that? Ethan smiled, but there was something sharp in his expression. Because once the cops get here, I'm going to show them exactly what I found when I installed this gate. And trust me, you're not going to like it. Margaret's smirk faltered for the first time. Doubt flickered across her face. Ethan turned toward the side of his property, where something strange had caught his eye earlier that morning, something that could change everything. The unearthing. Ethan leaned casually against his locked iron gate, arms folded, as he watched Margaret pacing angrily back and forth on the sidewalk. Her phone was clenched tightly in her hand, and the smug expression she wore seemed to be faltering, replaced with a mixture of frustration and impatience. He knew she was waiting for the police to arrive, expecting that her call would send a team of officers barreling down his driveway to force him into submission. But Ethan wasn't worried. He had spent too much time being pushed around by Margaret and her ridiculous HOA rules, and he was ready for this fight. A distant rumble announced the arrival of a police cruiser, and Ethan saw the momentary spark of triumph in Margaret's eyes as the black and white vehicle pulled up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and a woman with sharp, no-nonsense eyes. Margaret's demeanor shifted instantly. Her posture straightened as she rushed forward to meet them. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she began, her tone dripping with exaggerated concern. "This man has illegally blocked access to a public road and is refusing to comply with our community regulations. He's violating HOA bylaws and creating a dangerous obstruction." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unimpressed with the dramatics. The female officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Ramirez, turned her attention to Ethan. "Sir, is this your property?" she asked in a measured tone. Ethan nodded, reaching into his back pocket to produce a folded document. "It is. Here's my deed, which clearly shows that my property line extends past this gate. This is a private driveway, and the HOA has no legal claim over it." Margaret let out an audible scoff, rolling her eyes as if the very idea was absurd. "He's lying," she declared, jabbing a finger in Ethan's direction. "His driveway is part of the HOA's jurisdiction. All properties must maintain open access to shared community roads, and he's blocking one with that gate." Sergeant Ramirez took the deed from Ethan, her eyes scanning the document with practiced efficiency. Her partner, Officer Carter, crossed his arms and looked between the two with a weary expression that suggested he had no interest in being dragged into an HOA dispute on a Tuesday morning. After a few moments, Ramirez looked up from the paper. "Ma'am, I don't see anything here that indicates this is HOA property. As far as I can tell, this driveway belongs to the homeowner." Margaret's face flushed with frustration, her mouth twisting into a thin line. "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising. "The HOA has authority over all properties within this community. It's implied in our regulations." Officer Carter raised an eyebrow. "Implied?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. Margaret took a step closer, her expression shifting into one of forced patience. "Yes, it's understood that driveways are considered communal spaces, and the HOA has a duty to enforce that policy." Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "So what you're saying is, you don't have any actual legal claim to my property, but you just decided that you do?" Margaret's face darkened, her eyes narrowing. "It's about community standards," she snapped. "We have rules for a reason." Sergeant Ramirez sighed, handing the deed back to Ethan. "Ma'am, unless you can provide a legally binding document that shows the HOA owns or has authority over this land, there's nothing we can do here." Margaret's frustration bubbled over into anger. "I demand that you order him to remove this gate. This is a clear violation of our regulations, and he is obstructing access." Ramirez didn't even blink. Ma'am, this is private property. There's no criminal violation here. Desperation flashed in Margaret's eyes, and she turned to Officer Carter, attempting a different angle. Fine, then arrest him for harassment. He's being hostile, and I feel threatened. Ethan couldn't help but laugh, shaking his head. Threatened? Margaret, you called the cops on me for putting up a gate on my own property, and now you're the victim? Carter sighed, rubbing his temple. Ma'am, filing a false report is a crime. I suggest you stop before you actually do something illegal. Margaret's mouth opened, then shut, as she seemed to realize that her usual tactics weren't working. For the first time since the officers had arrived, she hesitated, her confidence faltering. She had expected them to side with her immediately, to treat Ethan like a trespasser in his own home. Instead, she was being warned about making false reports. Sensing her uncertainty, Ethan stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. Since the police are already here, I think this is a good time to show them what I found this morning. Margaret's posture stiffened, her expression flickering between anger and something that looked suspiciously like fear. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice sharp. Ethan gestured toward the side of his driveway, where a patch of disturbed soil stood out against the rest of the neatly landscaped area. While installing my gate, I found something buried near the HOA's boundary line. Something I think the police are going to want to see. The officers exchanged a glance, and Sergeant Ramirez motioned for Ethan to lead the way. All right, let's take a look, she said. Margaret's eyes widened, and she took an involuntary step back. This is ridiculous. You can't just dig up someone else's land. Ethan ignored her, grabbing a small gardening shovel from the side of his house. He knelt down, working quickly to clear away the loose soil. Within moments, the shovel struck something solid, a wooden crate. He reached down, brushing away the remaining dirt until the crate was fully visible. Margaret's breathing grew louder, a thin, ragged sound that betrayed her growing panic. You need to stop, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This has nothing to do with the current issue. Ethan didn't respond. He used the edge of the shovel to pry the lid off the crate, revealing stacks of documents, financial records, and, most damning of all, photographs. Hundreds of photographs taken from security cameras placed all over the neighborhood. Ethan picked up one of the photos, his blood running cold as he realized it showed a neighbor's backyard. Another photo showed the inside of someone's garage. These weren't just random images, they were illegal surveillance photos. Sergeant Ramirez knelt down, flipping through the files with a frown. Her expression darkened as she took in the contents. These are private properties, she said quietly. Officer Carter pulled out a stack of bank records, his brow furrowing. And these show unauthorized withdrawals from HOA funds. Margaret lunged forward, her face twisted in desperation. You have no right to go through that. Ramirez shot her a sharp look. Step back. Now. Ethan stood, crossing his arms as he watched Margaret's face pale. Looks like my gate isn't the real problem here, Margaret. But you definitely have a problem now. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, she had lost control of the situation. And Ethan knew that the battle he had been fighting for months was finally coming to an end.